So we'll start the meeting. And our presentation today is a look at farmers in conservation by Steve Olson, conservation planner, soil health specialist from the Dunn County Environmental Services Department. The presentation will cover the Red Cedar Conservation Farmers producer-led watershed group. The group promotes soil health to improve surface and groundwater quality and to increase community capacity throughout the project area. The group has hosted conservation field days and workshops to promote the use of best management practices to improve soil health through the implementation of no-till and cover crop planting and nutrient management planning. The producer-led group was established in 2018 and is starting their third year of implementation. Welcome, Steve Olson. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Let's see here. I can take over sharing my screen.
Yeah, hi, Steve. Thank you for coming this morning.
You bet. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I don't know if somebody has to allow me to share.
I think that's fixed now. Give it another try.
Okay. All right. Can you see the presentation?
Yep.
All right.
That's great.
Oh, except we're at the end. That's not good. Bear with me a second.
No problem.
All right. I hope you're looking at what I'm looking at. A look at farmers in conservation, the Red Cedar Conservation Farmers Group. Is that what we see?
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. I'll get started. Well, thanks for the introduction there, Cheryl.
Yeah, no problem.
My name is Steve Olson, conservation planner, soil health specialist with the Dunn County Land and Water Conservation Division. I actually started here in the county back in 1995, right out of college. Worked here for 5 years on the South Fork of the Hay River Priority Watershed Project. And then in 2000, I went to St. Croix County for 20 years. I worked on the Kinnickinnick River Priority Watershed Project up there. And then more recently up there, I was working with large producers and CAFOs with nutrient management planning and permitting. And then this opportunity came up a couple of years ago to come back to Dunn County, my home county. So I jumped on it and the rest is history. So it's enough about me. My major project areas, like I said, here in the county is I'm the collaborator for the Red Cedar Conservation Farmers Group. And then I also coordinate the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is a PREP program. We'll touch on a little bit here throughout this presentation. And then I also maintain the county groundwater monitoring well program, Well Intel, which the county has 8 groundwater wells monitoring systems established that we track fluctuations in groundwater elevation throughout the year. So we'll touch a little bit on that later also. The Red Cedar Conservation Farmers Group is a producer-led watershed group. It was established in 2018 as a 5-member board and with 1 lead farmer. The group met several times in 2018 to establish a mission statement, set goals, and develop a work plan. The group was awarded their first grant from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Agricultural Trade and Consumer Protection in the fall of 2018. And in 2019 was their first year of implementing their work plan and incentive program. And we'll touch bases on that here shortly. You might ask, what is a producer-led watershed protection grant? It's funded by the Wisconsin Department of Ag and Trade and Consumer Protection. The funds are focused on non-point source pollution abatement activities. Program goals is to improve Wisconsin soil and water quality by supporting and advancing producer-led conservation solutions, by increasing on-ground practices and farmer participation in these efforts. Currently, there's 31 projects that have been funded since 2016 within the state. And you can see right here is the Red Cedar Conservation Project area, which is in northeastern Dunn County, which is the project area is just north of Colfax up to just the southern end of Sand Creek, pretty much. And it covers 4 subsheds that we will go over here in a little bit. The Red Cedar Conservation Farmers mission statement is to collaborate to improve soil health while reducing phosphorus containing runoff from non-point sources. Goals is to achieve significant sustainable reductions in phosphorus load being exported to the Red Cedar River. Improve soil health by increasing organic matter content, improving water infiltration, and reducing erosion. And last but not least is conduct education outreach to improve soil health and water quality. And we will touch all of these goals and what the group has done to achieve those goals in the last 3 years of implementation. The 5 core principles to soil health is what really this group is focusing on with producers. Conventional farming practices over the last few years has really neglected or put these core principles to the side. We've kind of gone to a monoculture as dairy has left the landscape, and our perennial covers have vacated us. We've gone to more row cropping, and these core principles have really taken a back burner, and it's something that we're trying to emphasize and build upon again. And those core principles are to maximize soil cover, minimize soil disturbance, to have plant diversity in rotations and on the landscape, and to have a continual live plant and root within that soil so that the microbes have something to feed on continuously. And then really to integrate livestock back into the rotations, and we'll touch on that here a little bit later. And excuse me. So how do we get these core principles on the landscape? Well, here's a perfect example of one of the lead farmers in the group, or one of the board members of the group. Here we're no-tilling and planting green, and planting green may be a foreign terminology here, but you can see that there's a residue of soybean stubble there. Planting green is where there's a cover crop of rye that was broadcast onto the surface in the fall after the soybeans were harvested, and you can see that rye is starting, or was germinated in the fall, is continuing to grow here in the spring. We're no-till planting within that green, within that cover crop, and that cover crop will be terminated within a couple of weeks, typically after the no-till planting has taken place. So you can see here, we're maximizing soil cover. We're minimizing soil disturbance. We have plant diversity by having a cover crop on the landscape, and we have a continual living plant. So we've really implemented 4 of the 5 principles in this rotation here. And the one thing that we haven't totally integrated is the livestock integration. But in this particular situation, this landscape was broadcast with a very light application of turkey manure. So we're reintroducing nutrients, we're reintroducing organisms back on the landscape to feed and fuel that crop for production. You might ask, well, what are the benefits of cover crops? And why is that one thing that this group is expressing? We talked about it shortly, but it's really that it's providing ground cover. As you can see in the lower right-hand corner there, the rye cover crop after a corn crop harvest was chopped off. It's providing cover, just 30 to 50% residue cover on the surface will cut down 70% of your soil loss off of the landscape. The cover crop will retain nutrients. So if there's any residual nitrogen out there that may have a potential for leaching, those roots will go capture that or go after that nitrogen, bring it to the surface and the vegetation. As that cover crop is terminated, that nitrogen is released back into the soil profile in the spring after it's terminated. So covers have a huge benefit for sustainable cropping production. It also provides soil structure, as you can see here in this middle photo. These roots that are coming from that one little cover crop plant of rye, you can just see how it holds the soil together. And as this cover crop is terminated, these roots will decay away and it'll provide infiltration or macropores for rain. And that for the next year, as the rain hits the surface, it'll allow it to infiltrate instead of running off the soil surface. So it helps with reducing soil runoff or nutrient runoff, and it really feeds the soil biology and the microorganisms in a time when there's no other plants growing out there for 6 months out of the year in the fall or the winter or early spring. So it really keeps that whole soil ecosystem intact. And you can see here on the far left, we have a cover crop that was aerial seeded into standing corn. It was probably planted in early September or air flowing on in early September. And as this corn is probably going to be harvested in late October, early November, that cover crop is already established and growing. And it'll continue to grow in the spring, then come right up through the corn stubble as that carbon source of that corn is laid back onto the surface after harvest. And in the top right photo there, you can see some cover or some strip, or I'm sorry, strips of alfalfa that are growing, contour strips, and then also some covers that are growing on the landscape. So we have a continually green growing landscape here in this photo. So we can harvest those nutrients and really retain soil runoff. Another component of the group that they're really expressing is nutrient management planning, and that it really starts with the basics of you got to have a soil sample to know where your existing fertility levels are. Second, you have to account for on-farm nutrients. And for those of you, that's a cow pie there in the middle of a cover crop field. And it starts with on-farm nutrients and knowing where your existing soil test levels are to get those nutrients where we need them to produce a crop, and not just to treat those on-farm nutrients as a waste product. I mean, there's a lot of the major nutrients there as far as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but also on top of that is the micronutrients that really feed the microorganisms and produce, really exceptional crops. So we really got to take account for those nutrients. And it's really about practicing the 4 R's of agronomy and getting those nutrients in the right place, the right time, the right rate, and having the right source out there. So once we have the soil tests and we know what our on-farm nutrients are, we can generate a plan. Wisconsin has worked for a couple of decades now on development of SNAP Plus. It's a really great tool for producers. They can put their soil tests in there, their on-farm nutrients. Based on the soil type, the soil test levels, the program will generate a nutrient recommendation and application for those crop fields. I'm not going to get into this a lot today because it would chew up our whole half hour. But if anybody has any further questions on what's all in a nutrient management plan, I'd be willing to sit down for you, and it'll chew up a better part of a day. So, Another thing the group has been working on a lot is outreach and education. And the top right photo there is our lead farmer introducing Dr. Mark Borkart. He was generous enough to come up a year ago last winter and talk to the group about the state of our groundwater, what our concerns are, where we are currently, and maybe lead us in the direction of what we could do to, mitigate some of those alarming trends that we're going down currently. So it was a really great workshop, well received. We had over 70 individuals there that day. As part of the winter workshop also, we had a herbicide resistant water hemp presentation. There's some weed species out there that are becoming resistant to chemicals, and really looking at how we can address some of those as far as growing covers longer into the growing season, maybe using that allelopathic effects from rye to maybe mitigate some of those concerns and not relying so much on chemicals and so forth. In addition to that, field days the group has hosted here on the left. The group is talking about nitrogen use efficiency in row crop or in corn production, trying to produce their own nitrogen through legumes in mixes from the previous year, and maybe looking at using multiple species cover crops with legumes in them to produce nitrogen instead of relying so much on the synthetic or commercial fertilizers. Demonstration plots the group has set up is no-till versus strip-till plot, looking and comparing fertilizer use and nitrogen use and fertility from that standpoint, and looking at yields. And it's really based on the economic return on those yields, not just producing the highest yield. They've also looked at nitrogen use efficiency, full season cover crop, low disturbance manure injection, and then variable rate fertilizer applications is something that the group is really starting to grasp a hold of and would really like to continue on expanding here in the future. And we will touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. In addition to that, the group has felt it's very important to monitor where they were at prior to the project starting, what the trends are going to be during the project, and hopefully to monitor even, into the future and see if these landscape changes have made an impact. So with that, the group set up 16 surface water sampling sites. They've tested 2 rounds. You can see here that the village of Colfax is right here. Village of Sand Creek is just up here. So they have 4 subsheds: the Hay Creek, the Popple Creek, and Bronken Creek, and Trout Creek. And those sampling points within those watersheds. So it was sampled a year ago, or I'm sorry, a year and a half ago in the fall was our first sampling round. And then we did sampling again last summer, and then the group has planned to sample again this spring. Here within the next week or 2 is when we plan on pulling our next round of samples. So in addition to that, the groundwater samples have been pulled within the basin. Well water samples, they've collected 42 samples so far. 15 are scheduled or plotted for this year. And of those 42, about 20% of them are above the 10 ppm standard for nitrates. So to this point, since 2009 was the first year of implementation that the group started implementing practices on the landscape, they've adopted 2,537 acres of cover crops have been planted, 5,185 acres of no-till, 4,872 feet of grassed waterways have been established, 622 soil samples have been analyzed, and really a lot more soil samples than that have been analyzed. It's just, this is what the group has incentivized producers on, but many producers are pulling more samples than what has actually been noted here. In addition, 2,400 feet of buffer strips along streams or rivers have been established, the 35-foot buffer strips, and 31 acres have been entered into CREP program. The CREP program is a Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, where the federal government is actually leasing that land from the producer for a 10 or a 15-year contract, providing them a rental rate. And many times this ground is marginal ground for production. It's low, it's wet, it provides great wildlife habitat, or it's buffering next to a stream, or those finger areas of a stream that are shaded in that really don't have much yield potential. So to just let those areas sit and put them back into native prairie or trees or what have you, some type of perennial cover, is really a great benefit for not only wildlife, but water quality also. So the group has, within the project area, has established just in the last 2 years, 31 acres of that practice. And really the big, I guess I would like to call it the big hammer, the most benefit, the most economic return that we can provide to producers is really the implementation of nutrient management plans, and to show where those nutrients are needed, to show, what areas of a field, if the soil tests are low, that maybe those areas need to have a higher rate of fertilization to reach yield goals, or maybe there's areas that have high fertility that we can lower our rates of nutrients to apply to those areas. And that's really, we're just getting to the forefront of this with variable rate technology through the co-ops and through what producers have purchased through new equipment. But it's something I think is really going to grow here in the future. I don't think I know it's going to grow just based on the tight economic margins that there is with agriculture right now. It only makes sense if we can, if we can fertilize areas that need the fertility and not the ones that don't, and really look at what our yield potential is on certain soil types, and it varies greatly throughout a project area or through a field. It's something that as the technology grows, more producers are able to get on board and adopt it. So, and you can see here in the background, this is actually one of the waterways that was established through the project area. So grass waterways are just really conveyance channels of perennial cover that is maintained instead of having it in a row crop. It provides a conveyance channel when we have heavy runoff or rainfall events. So as part of the planning process that this group looks at continually, this is some information that was provided to us through the TMDL planning process of the Red Cedar. And you can see here on the left, we're looking at the Red Cedar River and the total phosphorus load and the trend as this was sampled at Lake Minoman. And you can see since 2010, the trend has really been going down, which is a good sign. It's actually a great sign, and what happened in 2010 that this trend is happening? Is it the implementation of nutrient management plans? Is it producer awareness? Is it, cows leaving the landscape? We don't know, to be truthful. We have assumptions, we have guesses, but it's a good trend, and it's something that we got to build on to improve water quality. But on the flip side of that is the alarming trend, and that's the trend of our nitrates. And you can see here that it's continuing to have higher concentrations in the runoff, and why, I'm not sure. I have assumptions, the group has assumptions. I mean, that's one reason why we are emphasizing nutrient or nitrogen use efficiency studies and trials. But it's something that we got to get a hold of, and it's something that, you know, that we're working on. So if anybody has any ideas, you know, at the end of the presentation here, I'd sure like to go down that path. So where to from here with the group? You know, right now we expand the variable rate fertilizer technology use. I think that's one of our biggest bangs for our buck, not only as far as the economic bottom line for the producer, but for the resource. You know, if we can fertilize those areas that will utilize it and need it, and have lesser rates on those areas that don't, it's just going to be a better bottom line for the producer, and it's going to be a better situation for the environment, no doubt. Planting more acres green, and what I mean by planting green, I talked about a little bit earlier, but if we can allow these rye and cover crops to grow to greater heights in the spring before we terminate them, we're only going to be capturing more nutrients out of the soil profile and bringing it back to the surface, where we can start, you know, that breakdown of those nutrients and provide it to those crops later on in the growing season, when they can utilize them. And, you know, if we have cover crops that are terminated when they're 2 or 3 inches tall, yes, it gives some benefit, but Rick Clark has provided some great information that shows that the longer we can let these cover crops grow, the more nutrients we're retaining and bringing back to the soil surface, or it's the soil profile, higher in the soil profile, and where they're available for the crop for that given year. You know, maybe we need to integrate some more livestock back on the landscape. You know, livestock have kind of left the landscape. We've gone to more confinement, which has its own challenges with bringing all of that waste back out onto the landscape. But, you know, if we can get cattle out grazing some of these cover crops, you know, breaking down them large carbon sources, you know, spreading their waste, you know, across the larger landscape or larger surface, you know, I think it has its benefits. Expand the nitrogen use efficiency plots. You know, that's one thing that the group is really looking at, is we gotta really hone in on what our nitrogen use needs to be and where we can tighten the rope with that. Expand crop acres and buffers, you know, to capture those nutrients that potentially come off of a landscape. Continue water quality monitoring. You know, hopefully what we're doing is going down the right path, but without monitoring, we don't know that for sure. So we really got to stay on top of the monitoring and the trending, and the models to see if what we're implementing is really gaining us what we want or need. And then the diversity of the crop rotations. You know, corn and beans have overcome the landscape. Having that 3rd or 4th crop in the rotation is really beneficial for, you know, resistance, providing, you know, the microorganisms in the soil something else to feed on. So really, if we can get another crop or 2 in the rotation, you know, that would have great benefits. Conduct more education and outreach activities, and really it's especially with the youth. I think we've touched on it a little bit, you know, with the youth at Farm City Days and that, but I think, you know, going forward, we need to teach the next generation, to get them going down the right path. And I think that's where it can really start. You know, if we get the youth involved, they seem to have a better influence on teaching their elders than what sometimes elders to elders do. So I think that's something really important, and the group does too. And then really continue field demonstration and plot trials. You know, producers, as they see this stuff firsthand, they buy into it a lot quicker instead of just being preached. So the more trials and plots we can get on the landscape, in the neighborhood, I think is a really, really good benefit for education and outreach. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And I guess I can open it up to any questions or comments. And how about that? I am at 10:30 exactly. So.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I do have a question. I don't know about the rest of you people. When I start clicking on these things, all of a sudden I screw up my screen. But anyway, how do I want to say this? You showed a map early on of the state of Wisconsin, and you showed where your group is in north of Colfax and up to around Sand Creek. Yeah. And as I look at that map, that's probably, if you squished all those blue areas into one, it might be 10, 15, 20% of the state is doing something like you're doing. And I look at the various work, the pieces that you're doing. You talked about ground cover and nutrient retention and soil structure and reducing runoffs and all those sort of things. And, those are all kind of goals that you have. And then I think of all the other blue areas around the state, and they're all doing, I assume, similar things. And together you have one, I hope, one massive goal that you are all sharing information with and notes on. You had some curves that you showed with phosphorus and nitrates, phosphorus coming down and nitrates going up. And so those are some things that you are measuring. And on the grand scheme, I'm wondering, is there some sort of a scorecard, if you will, a measurement card on how things are going around the state and how we are doing in achieving all these various goals? And are there numbers available? It's kind of how well are we doing? How are we measuring things? And is there something that is out there that can be shared with the public to show how your overall efforts are going, and maybe even how you're learning from each other? So that's kind of a mouthful I said there, but if you could comment on some of that, I'd be curious.
Sure. No, it's a great question, Steve. I guess first off, we have a statewide meeting every year. The group does, and they share ideas and share what projects are doing. But in different regions of the state, and let me take a step back within our project area, even our small project area. There's different challenges from operation to operation and field to field. So there's there's challenges there as far as creating a program that just covers everybody and everybody's resource concern, because there's different resource concerns, within those project areas. Like down by Madison, I know the watershed down there, I mean, they're highly dairy concentrated watershed. So their biggest concern is having the land base to utilize all those nutrients back on again. That's not really the case in our project area. We have more than enough land base to utilize the nutrients that are there. So it's different challenges there, and it's different resource concerns. Our primary resource concern was phosphorus, when the group was first established. And I mean, it still is, and we didn't really look at nitrates so much, but now we're looking at it, and after we've done some monitoring and some studying, we're finding out that, we really got to take a look at nitrates too. and the utilization of that. And, you know, it's great to see this phosphorus trend going the direction it's going, but we really got to stay on top of it and make sure that it continues that down that path. But, you know, to answer your question, is there numbers or tools? Yeah, there's models we can run, and then through the monitoring, we can, you know, trend it or see where we're going. But, you know, with Snap Plus, it, and it's probably for another day or another presentation, but with Snap Plus, it's a model used to look at the soil within the field, the soil test levels, the slopes of the field, the receiving water, the distance to that receiving water, and there's what's called a phosphorus index within that model on a field by field basis. So it tells us what our phosphorus potential, or what the phosphorus load is coming off of that field on a per acre basis. So with running these fields, you know, they might be at a 2 or 3 pounds of phosphorus per acre load, and by adopting these conservation practices, we might get them down to a 1 or a half a pound of load annually. So that's a tool that we can use. We're working on those numbers right now as part of our TMDL reporting. So yeah, it's something that we'll have. We don't have it right now, but it's something that we're working on. There's also Stepple, which is a DNR model that we can use to run and see what our load reductions are. But really the big one for the producer, and which every producer has to have, you know, is a nutrient management plan. And if we can start with the soil loss calculation and the PI index, it's a great way to educate, and a great way for producers to see what their impacts are. One alarming trend, I shouldn't say alarming, but one concerning trend is my old project that I worked on was the Squaw Lake Priority Watershed project, which is back in the early 90s. It's in northern St. Croix County, and we adopted no-till and we adopted cover crops in that watershed project, and we had a reduction in phosphorus load, in particulate phosphorus load. But because of the practices, our soluble phosphorus load trends went up. So we had less soil reaching our receiving water, but we had just as much, if not more, phosphorus that was actually running off the landscape in a soluble form. But it's a little bit different watershed in the fact that it's a very small watershed. It was only 2,500 acres. It was a very unique project to work on, in the fact that we had all the producers on board and adopted all these practices, and we did on field edge monitoring, but we didn't get the results that we wanted as far as, you know, reduction in phosphorus to that receiving water. But the issue there is spring runoff. That landscape was froze, and the years that the ground was still froze and we had runoff events, that's when our loading took place. The rest of the year, there was absolutely no loading that took on to that watershed. So I always joked with the group, and I said, if we could have put in some type of in-ground heating system in that watershed, so we didn't have frozen ground conditions, some type of geothermal practice, we wouldn't have had a resource concern. But that's probably a little cost prohibitive. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Steve, I have several questions, and not enough time to ask them all, but, you know, a couple of them. Talk a little bit more about the rye allelopathy. One of the reasons that I'm concerned is, you know, I watch, you know, the cover, you know, what your group, you know, what the Red Cedar, you know, farmer producer-led group is doing is wonderful. And I'm so excited about the monitoring. That's what we all need to be doing, is monitoring before and after and watching. So congratulations on all that. But I'm concerned about the amount of herbicide use I've seen, you know, killing off the cover crops. And you're talking about exploring rye allelopathy to deal with that. One question. And second is, you know, do you have some sense of what the Red Cedar group is doing relative in the goals and the practices relative to the other farmer-led group in Dunn County?
Well, first off, I guess with the allopathic effect from the rye is if we can allow that rye to grow to near maturity state and then roll or crimp it down. And I could have provided a slide with this, or maybe it's for a later date, but to allow that rye to grow, you know, it's 3, 4, or 5 feet tall, roll or crimp it down, it creates a mat, like a straw mat on the surface. And that really not prohibits, but it hinders weed seed germination. It's just another practice that we can, you know, maybe offset some of the use of herbicides, or maybe even eliminate the use of herbicides, you know, in that given year. And I'm sorry, Kathy, what was the second part of your question as far as what other areas around the state?
You know, what the other Dunn County farmer-led group is doing, are their projects similar? You know, are they doing monitoring, you know, the water monitoring like, you know, like your group is, you know, the Red Cedar group is doing?
I am not aware of the monitoring that they did there, that they have done. I know when I worked on the project back in 1995 through 2000, we did a lot of nitrate testing and bacteria testing with wells, but I'm not aware of any surface water sampling that they have done to this point. They have similar, they're promoting no-till and cover crops within that project area. You know, doing the same field days, demonstration days. I've worked with a couple of producers in that group that have done nitrogen use efficiency studies on their farm. We're going to expand that this year in that project area. So it's similar, but they don't have the exact, or you know, they don't have the exact same formula as what we do. And they are spearheaded by another person within the office here. So they have a different collaborator, Amanda Hansen, is a collaborator for that group. And they have been around longer than this group. They were established, actually, I think it was in 2016. They were one of the first groups to receive a project grant from Purdue or from DATCAP.
I'm going to sneak in another question, but I want to wait and see if somebody else has other questions.
I have a short one, but you go ahead, Kathy.
You know, you talked about trying to expand the rotations, which to me just seems so important to get some diversity in crops and helping the economics of farmers, as well as our environmental, you know, water quality. Is there something that we as non-producers can help in terms of marketing or some other kind of thing to help with that? You know, once again, I know it has to be farmer led, but does economic development need to be a part of this? Is there something that we need to do to help farmers expand their markets so they can have additional rotations?
Yeah, I think there's always something that we can come together on. You know, the biggest thing is, you know, trying to get a small grain in these rotations. So, you know, and a lot of the small grains are produced out west or into Canada, you know, as far as wheat or oats. It's tough in Wisconsin here with the humidity issues to get small grains to meet the market demands as far as test weights and all of that. But it's not to say that it can't happen. You know, there's hybrid development of some of those species that this group is actually exploring with. As far as rye, and you know, some of that is starting to be grown for seed within the basin. So, you know, there's markets. You know, the biggest thing is the market, and you know, I guess short of eating a lot more oatmeal, you know, I don't know what else those markets would be, but it's just something we're just starting to look at. And another thing that, you know, I didn't touch on in this presentation, but the group is really starting to look at as far as the carbon credits and what's coming down the pipe with that. But that's for another day. You know, we're just starting to look at that. It's available to producers in other regions of the country. It really hasn't made its way to Wisconsin yet, but it's on the horizon. I'm actually part of a group tomorrow talking about that. You know, and with some of those carbon credits may become some other type of markets with small grain. And you know, if we can get some alfalfa or grasses back into the rotation, you know, that's a big benefit. You know, I'm not a horse person, but when I worked on the Kinnickinnick River project down by River Falls, some of the most profitable crops for producers down there was growing grass hay, because of the influence of the university and our horse program, and people were feeding horses. And it's markets like that, little niche markets that can put other types of vegetation on the landscape.
Yeah, I have a kind of a quick question, Steve. When I look at the map of Wisconsin and all those blue areas, and I look at, this is kind of a broad question. Do you sense that the farmers are embracing this effort that is going on, and they're kind of like, boy, this really is something we want to support more? Or do you have a sense that there's skepticism, or is it kind of somewhere in between on those two? In other words, how energetic and how lively might a program like this go looking forward?
You know, there's some producers out there that are just dove into this hog wild and have adopted these practices 100% across their operation. And that's one thing that we talked about at the state level, is how do we keep this momentum going, and how do we build upon it, and, you know, expand upon our project areas. And, you know, that's our biggest challenge. But I mean, there's some producers out there that would say they would never go back to the way they were farming conventionally after adopting these practices. And it, you know, it takes time. But at the same token, you know, change doesn't happen overnight for anything. So that's really where we're at. But I mean, there's some great leaders out there that are pushing this and optimistic, and have proven that it works, and, you know, have shown their bottom lines. And I would just share this with the group. If you ever have a chance to watch a video, watch Rick Clark from Ohio, his video. He's got a YouTube video out there. He spoke at different areas around the state, but the way he presents this and the way he expands upon how this has affected his bottom line, it's just phenomenal. So I would really, it's worth the half hour or the hour to really look at his presentation.
Steve, could you email that YouTube to me, and then maybe I can share it with the group?
You bet. I would, certainly.
I was
Yeah.
going to say, my favorite part of that Kiss the Ground movie was the portion, I don't know if any of you have seen that yet. I think Steve Hogseth has. And it's the portion where you have a conventional farmer. I don't remember where he's located, but he goes from, you know, traditional conventional farming, and then he goes to completely like diversifying with animals, crops. And then he shows, you know, he's talking to his fellow farmers and saying, look how much money I've saved because I'm not using conventional fertilizers. Look at the beautiful land I have compared to your bare land. And that's the best part. So I think what you're doing is great, talking to farmers in these groups. And as a non-farmer, but a rural resident, you know, I would love to see more of that where I live in Elk Mound. It's everything's conventional here. There's a lot of no-till for many, many years, but not much else, not much diversity.
I just received a note from Cheryl, and her audio is not working properly, and so.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I signed out and got back in. I don't know why it does
All
that.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna thank Steve for
Yeah.
his presentation, and thank all the all the farmers and all the participants in this program, Steve. I think it's very educational, and it's important for all of us to know what's going on. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, anyway.
Wonderful presentation.
Thumbs up. And so, yeah, we're a little over time, so we have to move on with our agenda. And so thank you, Steve, from everybody.
All right. Thank you. Have a
Thanks,
good day.
Steve.
Thank you.